The New York City Commission on Human Rights does not provide legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of the Commission. Enjoy the show.
Hello, New York. Welcome to the second episode of Rights Here, Right Now from the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I'm your host, Jose Rios, Chief of Staff at the Commission. If this is your first time tuning in, Rights Here, Rights Now airs on the last Monday of the month on WHCR 90.3 FM. Each episode will explore topics to help you live, work, and thrive free from discrimination in our city. We're also digital. Past episodes can be found on Spotify as well as on the Commission's website and YouTube channel. Before we dive into our show, I want to give some background on the agency. The Commission is the city agency that protects New Yorkers from discrimination in employment, housing, and in public spaces. The Commission is charged with enforcing the city's Human Rights Law, one of the broadest civil rights laws in the nation. The law prohibits discrimination against over 25 protected categories, such as race, age, gender identity, and sexuality. The Commission also seeks to prevent discrimination by conducting outreach and education and to educate New Yorkers on the rights and responsibilities under the law. The Commission provides trainings and workshops that detail the protections enshrined in the law. Our trainings are grounded in the idea that our rights are interconnected and that we all have a role to play to advance equity in New York City. You can learn more about our agency, request trainings, or report discrimination by calling 212-416-0197 or by visiting our website at nyc.gov/humanrights. Today, sitting in the co-host chair is my amazing colleague and friend, Deputy Commissioner of Policy and External Affairs, Joann Kamuf-Ward. Yay! Joann, last month you were a great guest on the show. How are you feeling? Are you excited to have your debut as a radio host?
I'm really thrilled to be here today with our guests who work every day at the Commission on Human Rights to bring justice to New Yorkers who have faced discrimination and who also are part of the efforts to prevent discrimination from occurring. Today we're going to dive into the New York City Human Rights Law's robust protections against housing discrimination in New York City.
That's right. Last month, in honor of Women's History Month, we talked about how the Commission promotes gender equity. And this month, April, is National Fair Housing Month. Today's episode will explore the Commission's extraordinary work to address and prevent housing discrimination in our city, and we'll also spend some time towards the end of the show to talk about another of the Commission's jurisdictions, discriminatory harassment.
Every New Yorker deserves a safe, affordable home. The Adams administration financed a record number of affordable homes last year and set a record for the most new supportive homes. Our job at the Commission is to ensure equitable access to all homes in New York City and to ensure people are not turned away or denied housing because of who they are. We're thrilled to be joined by a group of guests that work incredibly hard to do just that.
All right, well, let's jump right into it. Joining us today to talk about housing protections for New Yorkers with disabilities is the Commission's Interim Deputy Commissioner of the Law Enforcement Bureau, Kathy Carroll, and Managing Director of Project Equal Access, Anna Martinez. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Happy
you.
Fair Housing Month.
Happy Fair Housing Month. So we like to start off the show by asking guests, what is your favorite thing to do in New York City? Kathy, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. So I love New York City. I've lived here for 20 years, and it took me 10 years to find out that you could learn to surf out in the Rockaways. So that's going out to the Rockaways, enjoying the beach, and surfing is my favorite thing.
That's great. Anna?
Well, I'll always be a tourist, even though I've lived here for 20 more years. And there's always something new to see and do, and I enjoy either catching a Broadway show or seeing a new art installation or going to the park to relax or even try a restaurant. I just love New York.
Well, thanks for sharing. Let's jump into discrimination in housing.
So we're going to start with some of the basics. So Kathy, I'm going to start with you. You lead the Commission's Law Enforcement Bureau. We'll refer to the Bureau today as LEB. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that entails and the role of the Law Enforcement Bureau at the agency?
Absolutely. LEB is tasked with enforcing the city's Human Rights Law, which, as Jose mentioned, is one of, if not the broadest civil rights law in the country. Our role is to receive and initiate investigations into potential violations of the city human rights law, which covers all forms of discrimination. And since we're highlighting housing, specifically in housing, if someone feels like they've been discriminated against, they should reach out to us through the website or through the phone number that Jose mentioned. We will evaluate the claim, and if someone states a claim, we will either attempt to get involved immediately to resolve the ongoing issue through what we call pre-complaint intervention, or we will file a complaint with them and then submit the claim to investigation with one of our staff attorneys.
Are there some forms of discrimination that are more common than others, or some that you all see in your work more frequently?
In housing, we definitely see disability and lawful source of income as the two most reported cases.
I'd like to spend some time discussing housing discrimination based on disability. Can you illustrate some examples of how discrimination based on disability might manifest in housing?
In most types of discrimination, we see claims where someone's being treated differently because of their membership in a protected class. In disability, most of the cases that we see are what's called failure to accommodate, where someone requires some modification to their apartment for them to be able to enjoy it equally. The addition of ramps or grab bars and things like that.
Anna, in your role as Managing Director of Project Equal Access, what do you see as some common challenges that individuals with disabilities experience?
The most common challenges are lack of accessibility, especially in housing. Steps in front of an apartment building entrance is really an obstacle for someone who uses a mobility aid, like a wheelchair. There's also another common challenge, such as lack of grab bars in bathrooms. They are used a lot for stability. If they're not in the bathroom, it poses challenges for people with disabilities.
Kathy, the Commission is all about addressing discrimination when it happens, but also about preventing it in the future. What are some potential outcomes of a complaint claiming disability discrimination?
If we find probable cause, or that it's more likely than not the discrimination occurred as a result of a complaint, then we will resolve it through a number of ways. We'll, number one, make sure that the complainant is made whole with the provision of the reasonable accommodation and potentially monetary damages for any emotional distress that they suffered. But in addition to that, we will negotiate a series of affirmative relief, such as training, postings, affirmatively putting a policy in place so that everyone on both sides knows their rights and obligations as it relates to people with disabilities. Our motto always is, once we've seen you, we don't want to see you again. So we want to make sure that you know what your obligations are and that we won't have to file another complaint.
Can we talk a little bit about what the process is for someone who thinks that they might be experiencing discrimination? Like, what are the steps for them?
Absolutely. So someone can call 311, and if they say discrimination or reasonable accommodation, they'll be referred automatically to our hotline staff, who will do an initial assessment of their claim. And if it falls within our jurisdiction, so it's in the 5 boroughs, it's happened within the last year, then they will be scheduled either for an intake or it'll be routed for pre-complaint intervention with Anna's team if the accommodation is outstanding and it's something we can negotiate quickly and hopefully get the person the accommodation as quickly as possible. Anna's team will take over from there.
I can explain a little bit more about Project Equal Access.
That would be great.
Thank you. And the pre-complaint intervention process. For decades, the Commission's Project Equal Access has worked with housing providers, businesses, and employers to make New York City more accessible. Engaging collaboratively with these entities helps make spaces accessible to people with disabilities without the parties having to go through a formal complaint filing process. This often results in much faster resolutions for people with disabilities, and this effort is led by Project Equal Access, or what we call P. We are a small but mighty team of 2. When a person with a disability contacts the Commission, a member of the P team consults with the person to gain an understanding of the situation. If the complainant has not made the request to their landlord or building manager, we advise them to do so in writing. If the complainant has made the request and was denied, then Project Equal Access will conduct a physical assessment to figure out what accommodations are possible. And we use the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, as our guideline. If P determines that an accommodation is possible, then we proceed with our pre-complaint intervention process by contacting landlords or business managers to advise them on their obligations under the New York City Human Rights Law and to recommend the type of accommodation. P begins negotiating in good faith with the landlord to provide this accommodation. If P determines that an accommodation is not possible, then we work with the landlord to find other options. So it's not just we can't provide a ramp. We want to see what other options can we provide for that person with the disability. It could be something like transferring the person to another building that the owner has in their portfolio, which is accessible. P continues to work with the landlord in good faith until they satisfy the requirements of the reasonable accommodation. And if this intervention is not successful, then a complaint with LEB may be appropriate.
So can you talk a little bit more about what would make something a good candidate for P or for a pre-complaint intervention?
Yeah, since the pre-complaint process involves P working with a landlord or a business owner in good faith, it can provide that accommodation in a much shorter time frame than going through the normal complaint process. This ensures that a person with a disability will have immediate relief by getting the accommodation they need.
So if someone wants to find out examples of what has happened in the past, right? They're thinking, do I want to report to the commission? Are there places where we can find examples of either cases or other materials that can help them understand their rights?
Absolutely. Our website has samples of our settlements that have descriptions of the underlying facts as well as the relief that we were able to get, as well as our decisions and orders for cases that have gone through a full investigation and had to go to trial to reach resolution. Additionally, our annual report, which is available on our website, speaks to the different types of cases that Anna and her team work on, as well as the rest of LEB.
For people who are in apartments in New York or who are looking for housing, there's a whole bunch of agencies out there. So what makes the City Commission different than either going to legal service provider or going to an agency at the federal level like HUD, which a lot of people have heard of?
Anna and her team will go out and do site visits to individually assess whether something can be made accessible and then attempt to negotiate it right away. It's something that is a much more immediate fix to an issue that someone might have. Additionally, the New York City Human Rights Law is the broadest civil rights law in the country, and specifically for the jurisdiction of New York City, it is the broadest civil rights law. And so our definition of disability, what might entitle someone to a reasonable accommodation, is significantly broader than any other law that you're going to find in this area.
Can we talk a little bit about how the Commission works to prevent discrimination, specifically maybe disability discrimination, through your work as a law enforcement bureau?
Absolutely. So our Community Relations Bureau has a training platform, and they do trainings for members of the public and people who might have obligations. But in addition to that, our P team has a specialized training on housing discrimination as it relates to disability. Our source of income folks also have a specific training that's related to that, because those are the areas where we see the largest number of complaints.
I know that the Commission has the ability to assess civil penalties to violators of the law. The Commission has the ability to assess damages for people who have experienced harm. But then there's this whole world of affirmative relief. Can we talk a little bit about affirmative relief, what it is and what that might look like in terms of disability in housing?
So first and foremost, if the person still needs the reasonable accommodation, that's what we're going to negotiate and get that as quickly as possible. Then, like I mentioned, we'll do trainings, policy changes. If there's an ongoing relationship and it seems like there's some tension in the relationship that might cause problems in the future, we'll explore forms of restorative justice where the parties can come to the table to hopefully work through those things so that they won't be in front of us again. And really, anything that can suit the situation that might eliminate discrimination in the future. The statute gives us a lot of room to be able to be creative in this area, and we've come up with different types of creative affirmative relief that are suited to a particular situation in order to help prevent future discrimination.
Anna, I think that a lot of people might think about our work and think about, especially for Project Equal Access, might think, oh, they are just sitting behind a desk, pushing papers. But that's not true, right? A lot of your work is on the street.
That's correct. That is not true. So more often than not, my team and I are in the fields. We're actually meeting with the complainant at their homes, and they're telling us what accommodation they need. They're telling us why they need it, and we're working with them really closely to figure out what the best accommodation would be. The training that is conducted by P offers an introduction to the law and addresses in detail protections for people with disabilities. It goes into detail about some of the ADA guidelines that inform our work. It ensures that accommodations are not only provided by the entity, but also that they follow the ADA guidelines. That's most important. We want to make sure when we're providing an accommodation, it is something that the complainant or the person with a disability is asking for, but we also need to make sure that it's following ADA for safety reasons. There's also numerous examples of real-life P cases in our trainings and scenarios, and we talk to those during our trainings as well.
And I've heard people say, oh, my building's grandfathered in. I don't have to comply.
Yeah, that doesn't really mean much for New York City because it is a pretty old city, as we all know. You could probably say that all the buildings are grandfathered in. That doesn't stop the work that we do. It may require some more processes in terms of getting permits done. There may be a few other steps that the landlord or the business owner would need to take. But if an accommodation is possible, that's what we're going for.
And we acknowledge that this is a very confusing space for landlords.
Yeah,
there are
sure.
a lot of laws that they have to comply with, and even sometimes the most well-meaning folks will get caught up in this insider lingo on what it means to be accessible. So just to be clear, there's something different between a building that has to be accessible from the outset and something that has to be made accessible in response to a reasonable accommodation. So I think there are buildings that don't have to be made accessible because they are quote unquote grandfathered in because they were built before the ADA went into effect. But that doesn't mean that if an individual comes to them requesting a reasonable accommodation, they don't need to explore it.
What's wonderful is when we are meeting with the landlords or business owners, we've had aha moments where the landlord or the business owner may not have known that they needed to make that ramp a little less steep, or may not have known that they needed to put in a special alarm system that lights up to let people with hearing loss be alerted to emergency situations, for example. So it feels good to be able to get an accommodation for a complainant and also have a teaching moment for a respondent.
And I imagine there's circumstances where even a tenant who's been in a building for some time, their needs might change. They might have a disability that changes over time. So should those folks come to you as well?
Yes.
And
I love a simple answer. Yes.
Are there limitations on what housing is covered by the law, or is all housing in New York covered by the law?
Almost all housing is covered. Anything that's been advertised is definitely covered. It's all out there.
Joann, do you want to give folks that website where they can get more information from our commission again?
nyc.gov/human rights for all the trainings and resources that we've talked about and much, much more. So thank you, Kathy and Anna, for speaking to us today and for sharing the great work that you do. We're going to come back and talk about source of income discrimination, which is one of the most prevalent forms of discrimination that we see at the Human Rights Commission.
In New York City, source of income discrimination is illegal. It's illegal for landlords and housing providers to deter you from housing spaces because you pay your rent with a voucher or government subsidy. Recently, 3 companies settled a source of income discrimination case for $10,000 in emotional distress damages. Housing seekers alleged that the landlord, property manager, and broker denied them the opportunity to rent an apartment in Brooklyn because of their use of a Section 8 housing voucher. The housing providers also agreed to revise anti-discrimination policies and attend trainings on the city's human rights law. If you've been a victim of source of income discrimination, to report a violation, visit nyc.gov/voucherspaynyc or call 212-416-0197.
Please welcome Supervising Attorney and Head of the Source of Income Unit, Stephanie Rivera.
Hi.
And Supervising Pre-Complaint Interventionist, Daniela Dames.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Welcome, welcome.
So we're going to start off with our first question. What is your favorite thing to do in New York City? Stephanie, we'll start with you.
So I like to consider myself a little swaggy Brooklyn girl, and definitely hit up all the good summer markets, especially first Saturdays at Brooklyn Museum of Art. Always get the best things.
We love a good Brooklyn outing.
Daniela.
So I'm a Staten Island girl, and in order to leave the island, I have to get on a ferry daily, and I very much enjoy the ferry. So I use our waterways, and I absolutely love when it's really rainy outside and it's foggy and the city just disappears behind the fog. Absolutely amazing. Recommend.
So let's jump into source of income discrimination. Stephanie, can you start us off by explaining what source of income discrimination is and give a couple examples of how it might play out?
Lawful source of income discrimination is really any time a housing provider like a landlord or a managing agent or even brokers, right, real estate agents refuse to accept someone's public source of income, which can include things like housing vouchers, Section 8, city FAPs, or even things like cash assistance, really any sort of monies that are coming from a public source like a city, state, or federal government agency. So if a household is receiving those sort of benefits and a provider refuses to accept them as part of their rent payments, that would constitute essentially source of income discrimination.
One of the ways we talk about source of income discrimination at the Commission is that safe and stable housing is key for our communities to thrive. Vouchers are a lifeline for so many New Yorkers. Can we talk a little bit about the consequences for the people who do violate the law and then avenues for relief?
There's real human impact, right, when someone is refused housing. We have high rates of people experiencing homelessness right now, people who may need to leave their current place of residence because of emergency situations, like victims of domestic violence or other forms of abuse that need to quickly exit their home. And when they're not able to do that, they essentially remain in harm's way. And we recognize that people need the easy flow of relocation, right, and safe and stable housing can lead to other things, right? We know it increases health benefits, right? Student stability, and a lot of the individuals and households that rely on different forms of public assistance and housing vouchers typically have many young people in their households, right? And so that's going to have a real impact on the youth in their family. And so it is a chain reaction, right?
As you mentioned already, under the city's human rights law, landlords and brokers have obligations. What do you see as the most common ways that landlords and brokers violate the human rights law?
Unfortunately, we still hear things or see ads online with statements such as no vouchers or programs only, right? Even though lawful source of income has been a protected class under the New York City Human Rights Law since 2008. Any sort of like clear discriminatory statements like that are a big no-no. We also see something commonly referred to as steering, right? When someone is trying to push a specific tenant to an area or away from an area because of their lawful source of income, right? And so we see a lot of agents encouraging or leading households who rely on vouchers to things like the housing lottery system and telling them that they can only qualify for units through the housing lottery system, which is inaccurate, right? People with housing vouchers can rent anywhere just like everybody else.
We also see a lot of tenant discrimination for individuals who are already in place in their homes and then they receive the subsidy afterwards. We have a lot of people who wait many years for Section 8, unfortunately, and then they get ignored by their current landlords, so we intervene in those sense as well.
I think that's a really important point to hit because I think a lot of times we talk about SOI as in, source of income discrimination, which we say SOI in the office all the time. But we talk about it in reference to finding housing, right? But there's still discrimination that happens after you've secured housing. So can we spend a little bit of time talking about what that might look like?
So we receive the complaints specifically from folks that are already living in their homes, right? So they're responsible for their rent, and now they have the added assistance of being able to pay their rent with the voucher. So there is a system, there is a process to take place. The landlord has to submit documentation, and there's a lack of response after that. The person or the family don't hear from the landlord or from the managing agency, and then they reach out to us so that we can intervene, and we speak to the landlords because there is a time frame, right? The voucher expires after a while, and if they don't submit the application or if they don't submit the documents in due time, the household can lose that subsidy.
Sometimes people might confuse CCHR with the voucher provider.
Yes.
So that happens a lot of times. They're like, hey, something's wrong with my voucher. Can you fix that?
We cannot fix things with the voucher. So if your voucher expires, it's really important to understand who the administering agency is of your voucher. You're going to want to contact them directly and handle any issues with your voucher being renewed or extended. Maybe your budget needs to be recalculated to increase or decrease your tenant contribution. So anything in terms of like eligibility for the voucher program and what the program requires, that will go back to the administering agency.
We just ensure that the housing provider is doing what they have to do in order to activate the program and the voucher.
What are some of the ways that we reach communities and some of the ways that they can report to us?
Yeah, I mean, we have really amazing community partners that route households to us when they're experiencing discrimination. There's this really cool tool called Unlock NYC where individuals can basically fill out through an IT type tool and report their discrimination, and then the tool basically automatically sends the report to us with the supporting evidence that's uploaded. So I highly recommend that. And individuals can always call, like any forms of discrimination, right? Contact our phone number, and matters could be referred directly to us, particularly if they want to engage in a pre-complaint intervention.
That phone number is 212-416-0197. I would be remiss to point out that your team, Daniela, is the interventionist team. And so can we talk a little bit about the work that your team does to intervene when discrimination happens, and like what makes a case a good candidate for intervention?
Absolutely. I think that I have two different things to say here, which is like there's one thing about the emergency intervention. So folks that are in a particular space where the voucher is about to expire, so those kind of bring up more in our radar. But then pre-complaint intervention is meant to provide the housing provider with the opportunity to understand their actions and their practices. So we see a lot of ghosting in the community. We see a lot of people who inquire about the unit but do not get the response back. So pre-complaint intervention, like the name, it's before the complaint, right? It's before we actually start the process of a formal complaint. And so we inquire, we educate, right? If the landlord doesn't know about the human rights law, if they don't really understand how it is that the program works, we walk them through that process, right? We tell them that if you met one person or one family with a voucher, you've met just one person or one family with a voucher, right? Every single individual is very different, and the reasons why they receive that voucher is very different. So we kind of put in that component of, the human behind it, right? The person behind it, not just the money or the benefit, but is what you're doing to help essentially bring down.
And if I were a landlord, if I were a landlord or a broker or a realtor, why would I want to work with your team with intervention instead of just waiting for it to get to the complaint phase?
Well, if you wait for the complaint phase, there's possibly fees that can be put into that.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell agents when they have conversations with me directly as an attorney, you actually want to hear from my pre-complaint intervention team.
Yeah.
You don't want to hear from me. So,
once
once it gets to me, then I am looking at the matter in a very specific way through the complaint investigation process. Yeah. Whereas in the pre-complaint process, there's really a restorative justice approach, as we like to discuss it, right? It's an opportunity to make that household whole again after being harmed. And it can, some of the things can be very simple, like allowing someone to view and apply for an apartment, a very easy fix that doesn't have to escalate, or securing a unit, right, for that household. Because the goal at the end of the day is always housing for these households.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like also that there might be the benefit of learning obligations for those who may not be aware of what the extensive protections of the human rights law are. And we talked in the earlier segment about individuals coming forward to report to the commission. But there are lots of people who may prefer to report anonymously, who want to alert the commission to discrimination. Can those people still report if they don't want to be involved in a formal litigation?
Absolutely. Individuals can contact the agency, submit an anonymous tip, give us any sort of evidence they may have, and we can basically take it from there. We can conduct additional testing of the agent or the brokerage company or landlord and builds basically what's called a commission-initiated complaint, right? And so we will then pursue the investigation, right? A tip can be submitted typically by contacting our phone line again. You don't have to provide your information. You can speak to one of our intake members and they will take down any information you have about the incident in which the discrimination occurred.
And I think we were talking about sometimes landlords and realtors not knowing what their obligations are under the human rights law. What are ways that those individuals in particular can learn about the law?
We have a monthly training that we give out to housing providers. It's virtual, and it speaks about source of income, what it is, the different kinds of source of income out there, and the actions that you need to follow or the steps that you need to follow in order to rent to a person with a voucher.
Yeah, our course was actually recently accredited as well by the Real Estate Board. We have a partnership with Fordham University and their Real Estate Institute. And so brokers and agents who need continuing education credit, our class is accredited and worth 1.5 free credits.
Can we also talk a little bit about when something does get to a complaint stage and a case is either settled or it goes to an administrative trial? What are some of the ways that the Commission seeks to expand housing opportunities for individuals?
Yeah, so once for a source of income discrimination case, we find probable cause that discrimination occurred. There's a couple of unique solutions I think we really try to secure in these types of cases. The first being set-aside units, where we request a landlord or a management company to set aside a certain number of units in a specific time frame where they give voucher holders priority access to those units, right? Then our households get to apply, start their lease-up process with their administering agency, and have a smoother transition into housing. With brokers and real estate companies, we do take a slightly different approach. We try to really incentivize the agents to work with voucher holders. And so we may ask them to create different forms of broker incentives for their agents. Things like increasing the amounts of the broker fees that are given specifically to the agent versus the brokerage company. Maybe we ask them to front the brokerage fees, right, on behalf of those clients where HRA may be paying the brokerage fees directly as part of the voucher packet. So we're always trying to think of creative ways to encourage brokerage companies to think of housing voucher applicants as just as equal, right, prospective tenants as everyone else that may be paying cash out of pocket.
We're going to wrap up shortly, but I also wanted to ask you both if there's anything you want New Yorkers to know that we haven't already covered.
It's hard to find housing in New York City, but we try to make it, as simple as it can be, or at the very least as approachable, right? To make sure that everyone is just having a fair shot at housing.
Yeah, I think for lawful source of income, it's quite unique. It's easy for people to disassociate it as a protected class. And usually in my classes, the course that we do on a monthly basis, I tell an agent, if you're not comfortable saying this to someone because of another protected class, like substitute the protected class for something else, if you're not comfortable saying it to that person, you shouldn't feel comfortable saying it to someone because of their use of a housing voucher, right? It's your responsibility to treat them equitably and equally.
Thank you. Jose, anything else you want to add?
Jump on what Daniela said. Finding housing in New York is hard, and discrimination shouldn't make it harder.
Yes.
When it does happen, we're here to support folks who experience the harms that discrimination causes in the housing market.
Don't wait until you've experienced discrimination to
Yes.
contact us. I think, we talk so much about the work that we do that's preventative, and that's really to make sure New Yorkers know their rights. We've already heard whether you're a tenant or an applicant for housing, there are a lot of protections under the city human rights law and state and federal law too. So arm yourself with that information so you can go into a process knowledgeable about the rights that you have.
Thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having us.
Joann, our work as a commission has always been important. And then considering the affordable housing crisis, our work to prevent and address discrimination continues to be critical.
I couldn't agree more. Housing is one of the most persistent challenges in New York City. And listeners, if anything that we talked about seems like something you've experienced, please call 212-416-0199. 9-7 to speak with one of the staff at the commission.
And we talked about this a little bit last month with our commissioner, but like, even if you're not sure if it's discrimination, even if you just think it could be discrimination, contact us and, we'll work with you to figure it out. It's important to repeat also that we speak over 20 languages at the commission. We don't ask about immigration status. And so we're really just here trying to address violations of the law and to reduce harm in the community. The past few weeks has seen rising tensions on New York City's college campuses. As a city, we have the privilege of being globally diverse and home to people of many backgrounds. And so it's no surprise that our city's colleges and universities attract students from all over the world with different backgrounds, cultures, and beliefs. Students in New York City might not know that they have the same rights and responsibilities under the New York City Human Rights Law as anyone who lives in, works in, or visits New York City. And that is partially why this show exists, to share information to make sure that everyone can thrive in our city. Students in New York City are protected against discrimination in housing, at work, and in public spaces, including school campuses. And no one can be discriminated against based on their race, religion, national origin, age, immigration status, disability, and other protected classes under the New York City Human Rights Law.
I think today we want to talk a little bit as well about discriminatory harassment, which is protection in the New York City Human Rights Law. And really the idea for us is that freedom of opinion and expression, that's a constitutional right, and that should be respected and valued. However, when language translates into actions that interfere with a person's civil rights, and when that action is motivated by a person's actual perceived identity, it's a violation of the human rights law. And that's the term discriminatory harassment that I already mentioned. It's not tolerated in New York City. No one's allowed to do it, and everyone is protected from it. Discriminatory harassment is a very legalese-sounding term, so I want to illustrate with some examples of what this might look like. So one example is removing a person's religious garb, such as a hijab, a turban, or a yarmulke. Another is threatening to report someone to immigration to deport them. So discriminatory harassment really has three different pieces. It's when someone takes an action that is either threatening to you or involves force. It's motivated by one of the protected categories in the human rights law. And the person who did that action is identifiable, because if there's not an identifiable person, the commission's not able to move forward with a complaint.
It can be complex. Part of our laws can be complex to understand, and so that's part of also why we do things like the show and why we try to, make the information about our law more accessible so people can understand, because it's so easy to say we all have rights, but it's also equally important to say we all have responsibilities as well. The bottom line is that no matter who you are or what you believe, we all have the right to express ourselves without interference to our civil and constitutional rights. And we all have the right to live, work, and thrive free from discrimination in New York City. And so if anyone listening has experienced or knows someone who has experienced threats or physical harassment because of your identity, please call us. Call the Commission on Human Rights. We've said it a million times, but I'll say it again. Our number is 212-416-0197. You can learn more about your rights and responsibilities on our website at nyc.gov/humanrights. And you can also download a new resource we created for students to know their rights. You can always dial 311 and say human rights or discrimination, and they'll route you our way.
Jose, are there any upcoming events that you want to share?
There are some upcoming events. Well, one in particular that I'm excited to share. I think my team at the Commission has been really trying to create types of events that live at the intersection of art and activism. As you know, Joann, in February, we did a poetry slam for Black History Month. And so we're doing something again for AAPI month. We're doing a art pop-up. The Commission will be co-hosting an art pop-up event with the Chinese American Planning Council in honor of AAPI month. Joann, it's spring. The climate is changing. What are you looking forward to now that it's not 50 degrees every other day?
Running around various parks in New York City.
The summer is also peak time for our Community Relations Bureau to be out doing street outreaches at subway stations. And so if you see somebody out on the street wearing a Commission on Human Rights shirt, feel free to stop by and ask them about your rights under the New York City Human Rights Law. All right, everybody. Once again, this has been Rights Here, Rights Now, a radio show sponsored by the New York City Commission on Human Rights on WHCR 90.3 FM. We'll see you next time.